The soft chime of boarding announcements echoed through Terminal 4 of JFK Airport as the luxury flight to San Francisco prepared for departure. People bustled past with coffee in hand, luggage in tow, some glued to their phones, others wrapped in hurried goodbyes. Among them was a tall, sharply dressed man in his early 40s, calm, composed, and focused. His name was Jonathan Miles, CEO of Airline Tech, a billion-dollar startup that revolutionized education systems across inner-city schools in America. With skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that carried the weight of silent storms, Jonathan was not just another executive. He was a story of perseverance carved from a childhood in Alabama, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses and read poetry to him by candlelight. He wasn't in the habit of flaunting his success. He flew commercial, often in business or first class, not out of vanity, but to rest during the rare downtime between meetings. Today, he was headed to San Francisco for an education summit where he would speak about access, equity, and the power of giving children a fair chance, values his company was built upon. Jonathan boarded early and settled into his VIP first-class seat, 1A, right by the window. He took out a worn copy of Maya Angelou's letter to my daughter and smiled. It had been his mother's favorite. But then, something unsettling happened. A flight attendant, blonde and visibly nervous, approached. She looked at Jonathan and offered a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Sir. I'm so sorry, but there's been a seating mistake," she said. "We need to move you to seat 14C, there's been a mix-up." Jonathan blinked, slowly closing his book. 14C. "That's economy," he said, voice calm but puzzled. "Yes, but it's still extra legroom. We're terribly sorry." The other passenger, "Well, it's complicated." Jonathan's gaze followed her nod. A white man, about 50, balding, wearing a designer suit and clutching a Rolexed wrist, stood at the front with an impatient expression. He waved his boarding pass. "That's my seat," the man declared. "I paid for 1A." Jonathan took a slow breath. He had the same seat printed clearly on his ticket, booked weeks in advance by his assistant. But he saw the panic in the flight attendant's eyes, not fear for safety, but fear of confrontation. He stood up. Without raising his voice, without demanding an explanation, he simply said, "Of course," and gathered his things. Grace, even in insult, was a lesson his mother had taught him young. The cabin watched in silence. A few passengers exchanged glances. No one said a word. Jonathan took his new seat, squeezed between a crying toddler and a man with a snoring problem. The flight prepared for takeoff. And then, the unexpected happened. 5 minutes after takeoff, the cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled into their movies and meals. But there was a quiet buzz of discomfort among a few. Some had seen what happened, a man unfairly displaced. Some had looked away. Some had shrugged it off as policy. No one asked questions. Until a little girl did. She was no older than 8, seated in first class beside the man who had taken Jonathan's seat. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered too loudly, "Why did the man with the nice smile have to go back? He was sitting there first." The mother flushed, looked around, and gave a hushed, "Shoo, sweetie." The man in 1A overheard. He shifted uncomfortably and ordered a glass of wine. The flight attendants continued to serve, avoiding eye contact with the man they'd sent to coach. But not all of them. A junior flight attendant named Elena, new to the airline and fresh out of hospitality school, had seen everything. She had watched Jonathan stand up not just from his seat but from his right. It stayed with her. Something about the dignity of it haunted her deeply. When meal service came, she approached Jonathan's seat in 14C. "Sir," she said gently, I just want to say I'm sorry for earlier. It wasn't right. You handled it with such grace." Jonathan looked up and offered a smile, tired but kind. "Thank you," he said simply. "Would you allow me to bring you a first-class meal instead?" she offered, voice low. He paused, then shook his head. That's kind. But I'm okay. She looked as though she might cry. You shouldn't be treated this way, she whispered. Jonathan nodded once. But you chose to say something. That matters more than you think. Then came another surprise. The man from 1A rose and walked down the aisle. He stopped in front of Jonathan, leaned slightly, and said, "No hard feelings. Just business class politics, you know. I'm a regular on this route." Jonathan looked at him, steady and unreadable. "It's never just business when dignity is the price," he said quietly. The man huffed and returned to his seat. But someone else had been watching, and listening, the entire time. In the back row of first class, seated quietly, was a woman in her 60s. Short, silver-haired, and dressed in a modest pantsuit, she looked like anyone's grandmother, unassuming, polite, invisible. But she was none of those things. Her name was Carolyn Beckett, chairwoman of the airline's board of directors. She hadn't announced herself when she boarded. She was flying incognito to conduct a discreet review of the airline's customer service after complaints of discrimination surfaced in internal audits. What she had just witnessed confirmed every suspicion she had. She asked the senior flight attendant to fetch the passenger from 14C, quietly and respectfully. Moments later, Jonathan found himself standing in the first-class galley, facing the woman he didn't recognize. "I saw everything," she said. "And I need you to know, not just as a passenger, but as a human being, that what happened was wrong. Deeply wrong." Jonathan said nothing at first. Carolyn extended her hand. "I'm Carolyn Beckett, chair of the board." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I apologize, Mr. Miles. Not as a representative of the airline. As a person. I don't know who made that call, but I intend to find out." Jonathan finally spoke. "What matters more is whether it changes." Carolyn nodded. "It will. Tonight." The plane landed in San Francisco just past midnight. The crew moved swiftly, smiling for the passengers, but tension hummed beneath their polished exteriors. As passengers disembarked, a quiet announcement was made, "Mr. Jonathan Miles, please remain on board for a brief conversation." Jonathan stayed seated, as did Carolyn Beckett and the airline's operations manager who had boarded shortly after landing. In that conversation, quiet, swift, and resolute, 5 flight attendants and a gate supervisor were relieved of duty, pending investigation. Not out of vengeance, but because the system needed correction, not cover-up. Only Elena, the junior flight attendant who spoke up, was commended, and later promoted. News spread the next day like wildfire. Not because Jonathan posted about it, he never did, but because a teenage boy from seat 14D had filmed the entire exchange and uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "He gave up his seat with grace. She gave him justice with power." The video went viral. Millions watched. Comments flooded in. But Jonathan's next move wasn't retaliation. It was redemption. 1 week later, Jonathan took the stage at the Education Summit in San Francisco. Cameras flashed. Journalists whispered. But he didn't mention the flight. Instead, he talked about the invisible weight so many carry, the unspoken slights, the silent wounds. "I don't want apologies," he said to a packed auditorium. "I want awareness. I want children to grow up in a world where dignity isn't negotiable. Where kindness is policy. Where humanity outweighs hierarchy." The crowd rose to its feet. The message reached far beyond the conference room. Within a month, the airline instituted mandatory anti-bias training. Within 2 months, 3 other airlines followed suit. Elena, the young flight attendant, became a public speaker on integrity in the workplace. Carolyn Beckett quietly retired that year, her last act ensuring lasting reform in an industry long overdue for it. As for Jonathan, he continued flying commercial. Still reading Maya Angelou. Still choosing grace. Because sometimes, change doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing up silently, and letting the world see what dignity truly looks like.